So welcome to this talk entitled Fermentation 101. I'm Dr. Trish Murray. I'm a functional medicine specialist. I'm also a best-selling author and I consider myself the health catalyst speaker because I'm trying to catalyze folks to take control of your health and transform your lives. Let's get started by covering the basics. What is fermentation? Well, fermentation is the process of breaking down organic substances by introducing either yeast, bacteria, or other microorganisms. When the fermentation happens in your body, it's part of a metabolic process that produces chemical changes through the actions of enzymes that are produced by the microorganisms. In biochemistry, fermentation is defined as a chemical process by which sugars like glucose are broken down anaerobically. Anaerobically means in the absence of oxygen, so there won't be oxygen involved in this process. The fermentation process is at least 10,000 years old and is probably most commonly known in the manufacture of wine and beer. So, one end result of fermentation is alcohol, but it can also produce a number of different acids. Microorganisms, or a bunch of different kinds of bugs, basically, use carbohydrates that we eat, which are sugars such as glucose and others, fructose and other things, and they use these sugars for energy and for fuel. And this process breaks down sugar into acid and or alcohol. Fermentation is beneficial in that it can add new flavors and textures to your foods. It also extends the shelf life of food, making some nutrients more easily absorbed by the body, and it provides an environment for probiotics to grow and reproduce. Essentially, when a food is fermented, it's broken down, similarly to the way it would be broken down in your own gut. But this process, when you ferment something before you ever eat it, initiates the digestion and the breakdown process before you ever consume it. So if you have trouble with digestion, then eating fermented foods aids in digestion. Now, fermentation has been around a really long time. I mean, even way back in the Neolithic age, people have been fermenting foods, way before the benefits of the process were ever understood. Some common foods that use the fermentation process include very common things, obviously, we ingest all the time: sourdough bread, wine, beer, and other alcohols, cider, vinegar, cheese, kombucha, sauerkraut, kimchi, tempeh, miso, and of course, yogurt. Now, there are essentially three different types of fermentation that people use to ferment their foods. Lactic acid fermentation is one. Ethyl alcohol fermentation is two. And acetic acid fermentation is the third. So what we're going to do now is take a closer look at each of these types of fermentation. Now, lactic acid fermentation happens when yeast and bacteria strains convert, again, starches or sugars, specifically into lactic acid. And lactic acid bacteria are vital to producing and preserving inexpensive, wholesome foods, which have been extremely important for feeding, actually over hundreds of years, impoverished cultures for hundreds of years. The lactic acid fermentation method is one of the most old school food preservation methods that exists. Lactic acid fermentation makes foods like sauerkraut, pickles, as you see on the slide, kimchi, yogurt, and again, sourdough bread. So that's lactic acid fermentation. In ethyl alcohol fermentation, yeast specifically is broken down, and it breaks down the molecules again in a starch or a sugar and turns it into alcohol and carbon dioxide molecules. So you notice the bubbles on the top of your beer, for example, or sometimes even on the top of a wine. This type of fermentation creates wine and beer. But vodka is also made from the fermentation of grains or potatoes. So alcoholic fermentation occurs by the action of yeast, and the most common yeast is called, don't say this 10 times fast, folks, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. And lactic acid fermentation occurs in the action by the action of yeast, as well as sometimes bacteria. The third type of fermentation is called acetic acid fermentation. And this is caused by specifically acetic acid types of bacteria, which break down, again, starches and sugars from grains and fruits or in vegetables and ferment them into sour tasting, typically vinegars. And this process produces things like apple cider vinegar. So you see the apples on the slide. Wine vinegar. You can also make something called water kefir. Most people may be more familiar with kefir as a dairy-based fermented product, but you can make water kefir if you're someone who does not tolerate dairy, but you want to make yourself a probiotic or fermented type thing at home. I used to make water kefir all the time, but then I switched to the other type of acetic acid fermentation, which is called Kombucha. Now, acetic acid bacteria are a group of gram-negative bacteria which oxidize, again, folks, you notice this theme of sugars and ethanol and produce acetic acid during fermentation. There's a whole family of bacteria called Acetobacteriae, and they're what are used in acetic acid fermentation process. These bacteria are aerobic, which means you can use oxygen, or they can live in the environment of oxygen, and therefore they require oxygen for their survival. Whereas the other two types of fermentation we've discussed, the lactic acid one and the ethyl alcohol one, is anaerobic and therefore occurs without the presence of oxygen. So vinegar is produced when acetic acid bacteria act on alcoholic beverages such as wine through an oxidation fermentation, so again, oxidation, and creates vinegar as a byproduct. So what's interesting to get here, folks, is that vinegar is produced through a two-stage fermentation process. The first stage is actually the ethyl alcohol fermentation by yeast to create the alcohol, and then a second form of fermentation, the acetic acid fermentation, that is using oxygen and the acetic acid bacteria to then form vinegar. Both probiotics and fermented foods play a role in healthy digestion, but they aren't quite the same thing. And this is where we want to differentiate. What's the difference between a probiotic food and a fermented food? There is overlap, but they are not the same thing. So let's go over this. Probiotics are defined as, quote, good, hence the pro bacteria in our gastrointestinal tract. But in order to be called officially a probiotic, foods require a known specific strain of beneficial bacteria that has been thoroughly tested for its quality Also, it needs to be thoroughly tested for its quantity or numeration, and also the DNA makeup of the bacteria that is in the food before its use, and it has to be labeled as such. So labeling of a verified probiotic food includes statements like, quote, live and active cultures. And it would be labeled as to X amount of probiotics. So 1 billion or 50 billion or 100 billion or 1 million or whatever that X is, it has to on the label say the amount of probiotics. And they usually use the units that are called CFUs, capital C, capital F, capital U. And this stands for colony forming units. And again, it might say something like 2 billion CFUs. And it may also list the specific name of the strains of bacteria in the food, like lactobacillus or another type of bacteria. Now, fermented foods are not as regulated and do not require any specifics in their labeling. Some are labeled as probiotics, but many are not. They don't have to meet any standards. And you can think of fermented foods as a mixed bag of different microorganisms. There are many types of fermented foods, and there are more different types of fermented foods than probiotic foods. And examples of fermented foods, again, include things like yogurt, but a non-probiotic yogurt, cheese, tempeh, tofu, sour cream, cottage cheese, miso, and all sorts of fermented vegetables. But one very common one is called kimchi, which is made of Napa cabbage. So the bottom line is this: including fermented foods in your diet is not the same as taking a probiotic. A probiotic must be labeled as such, must pass tests that show active cultures, and note the quantity and the type of probiotic that is present in whatever, either the pill or the food, for that matter. On another point, all commercially available foods must be pasteurized. So if you're not making your probiotics or your fermented foods at home, then you're buying them commercially, then remember they do need to be and are required to be pasteurized. And what that means is they undergo a very high temperature thermal process. And this process does kill a certain amount of the live bacteria in both probiotic and fermented foods. Now, the killed organisms are referred to in the food science world as what are called heat-killed cells that used to be live microbes or bugs. These have been studied more recently, and the good news is that the evidence is showing that these heat-killed cells also can have a positive effect on physiology and health. The bottom line is they still can have a positive effect, particularly on your immune system, as your immune system is constantly on duty, assessing your environment, your internal environment, for anything that is either, and determining whether it is friend or foe. And if there are more good microbes, or even if that microbe is not alive anymore, the genetics of it and the fragments of it are in your system, then your immune system becomes more familiar with that good fragment or that good microbe, and the fact that they're around, they're going to outnumber the bad. And so both are beneficial, whether they're live culture, or studies are starting to show, and research is showing, that even if you eat a probiotic and let's say the microbes die in your stomach due to the stomach acid, the fragments and the genetics of those probiotics, those pro-microbes, still will have a beneficial effect on your immune system as they go through the rest of your digestion and get absorbed into your system. So your microbiome is like a rainforest with multiple species of bacteria, yeasts, and enzymes living together. When you have a healthy balance of yeast and bacteria in your gut, fermented foods are fine to eat because they feed the majority of good bacteria and yeast already living in your gut. And health benefits of probiotic-rich fermented foods can enhance the gut biome by improving digestion and boosting your immune system. A diet rich in fermented foods increases the diversity of gut microbes and decreases molecular signs of inflammation. So again, quiets your immune system and it quiets inflammation. In one study at Stanford University, over a 10-week time that included 36 adults eating diets either high in fermented foods or high in fiber foods, showed that these diets had different effects on the gut microbiome and different effects on the immune system. It showed improved diversity of the microbiome. So your microbiome gets more diverse and more populated with the positive, and the levels of 19, folks, I said 19 different inflammatory proteins measured in the blood samples decreased. So 19 different inflammatory proteins that would cause more inflammation in someone's body were all decreased in the bloodstream just by eating these foods high in fermentation. One of the proteins in particular that's very well studied, and one of the more common ones studied, is called interleukin-6. Interleukin-6 is a very extremely inflammatory protein, and it's been linked to conditions such as rheumatoid arthritis, type 2 diabetes, and chronic stress. And eating a diet with fermented foods or high in fermented foods showed that it decreased this interleukin-6 protein. The high fiber diet alone, on the other side, did not demonstrate the same benefits. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't be eating high fiber, you should, but eating high fiber with also fermented foods is going to be your best bet. Now, if you have an imbalanced gut, and you know it, you already have either IBS or, let's say, inflammatory bowel disease, you get bloated, you have increased gas, you have either diarrhea or constipation, you have an imbalanced gut to begin with, then the fermented foods you eat can feed the bad bacteria and cause initially, in the beginnings when you start eating this stuff, you don't want to go hog wild, because it's going to feed the bad bacteria and cause initially more negative results and symptoms such as increased GI problems like bloating, gas, diarrhea, or constipation. If you have irritable bowel syndrome and are following a low FODMAP diet, things like sauerkraut made with cabbage, for example, which is a high FODMAP food, would not be on your list. However, you may be able to tolerate drinking a small amount of the fermented liquid from sauerkraut each day, for example, to start slowly shifting your microbiome. So you're just sort of seeding yourself with the positive bacteria. Or you could use something like kombucha, which is not made with a high FODMAP ingredient, and that might be the perfect option for you to try. And that's one of the reasons I use kombucha, because I do have IBS. I am sensitive to high FODMAP foods. I do follow a low FODMAP diet. So kombucha, which again, I'll do a show and tell with in just a short while here, is something that's made with green and black tea. So it's not a high FODMAP thing like sauerkraut. But again, always start with, even with fermented foods that are low FODMAP, start with a very small amount, monitor your reaction, and increase slowly as you tolerate more and more. And if you're not familiar with the FODMAP diet, this is an acronym that stands for fermentable, so obviously it fits this talk tonight, fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. It refers to foods that contain carbohydrates or sugars that are fermented more rapidly in the gut and can therefore cause more rapid gas production. So again, that's why FODMAP, which is an acronym, and those sugars can be fermented in your gut more quickly and therefore cause problems for people with IBS. So if you suffer from issues like bloating or gas, eating foods that are high in FODMAP can make your symptoms worse, and avoiding them can really, really help. But there are options in the fermenting world that can be tried. Again, like I said, like kombucha or water kefir, or even just fermenting yourself low FODMAP vegetables like daikon radishes or carrots, or other low FODMAP vegetables. So not only will fermented foods help your digestive tract, but they could improve your mental health too. Your gut and brain have a very close relationship, known in the functional medical field as the gut-brain axis. You see, 90% of our serotonin, which is, quote, the happiness hormone, is produced in your gut. This is widely studied connection, and there is always research coming out about how the foods we eat can affect our mental health. So if you are living with mental health issues like anxiety, depression, or cognitive concerns, optimizing your digestion and your immune system and your microbiome can be extremely beneficial to your overall mental health. When choosing pickled or fermented vegetables at the store, be sure to read the label and look for jars or packaging that says raw and unpasteurized, if you can find that, or lacto fermented. So again, raw and unpasteurized or lacto fermented. That way, you know that the good bacteria are still alive and ready to populate your gut. Now, kombucha is made from a SCOBY, which is a symbiotic colony of bacteria and yeast mixed with sweetened tea. It's been around for over 2,000 years and is beloved for its B vitamins, probiotic bacteria, and tangy flavor. And these days, kombucha is everywhere. You see it in the grocery store, you see it in health food stores, and it's a popular drink. It's typically made from black tea or green tea that's been fermented by a friendly colony of bacteria and yeast. So let's see if I can stop sharing here a moment. Slides. I'm going to bring my video back up. Let's see, on the spotlight. And all right, so you can see me, I can see that. All right, so what I wanted to do is stop here a second and do a little show and tell. So this is, in this little jar, is what's called a SCOBY. In the fermenting world or the probiotic world, one of the main things you need is the mother, or the seed, something that has the bacteria in it or the yeast in it, that is the mother, that the colony that is then going to cause the fermentation process, that's going to ingest the sugars you feed it and cause the fermentation process in order to create probiotics or fermented foods. So I'm going to actually pick this guy up. Now, what is a SCOBY? He's very slippery. He's trying to not be able to have me pick it up. Let me see how. This is not very easy to do. He's going to slip right through my fingers. But this, folks, is a SCOBY. And what does that mean? This is a biofilm. What's a biofilm? A biofilm is when yeast and microorganisms and bacteria live and create a colony, and then they secrete this slimy, thick, dense material that's their home. And this is a colony of bacteria and yeast, and it becomes the mother of kombucha. So this is what you put in. Let me show you now. So that's that show and tell that's a SCOBY. Now, folks, a biofilm, again, that's a colony of yeast and bacteria. We have biofilms in our body all the time. A best example is you go to the dentist, right? And you go to the dental hygienist and they scrape the heck out of your teeth to remove something. What are they removing? They're removing plaque. What is plaque? Guess what? Plaque is this. Plaque is a biofilm of bacteria that forms in us and on us in our gum, on the teeth near the gums. And that the bacteria in your mouth are producing that biofilm for their colony to live in and to protect them against, when you brush your teeth, against things that would kill them. And so that's how they live. Now, kombucha is this. So what I do is this is how I do it. When this is done, like I made this about 2 weeks ago now, I think, and it's been sitting in just my cupboard. So what I do is I take another mason jar like this big, same size, and I put in this size mason jar, which is about 8 cups big, I put a half a cup to 3/4 of a cup of organic cane sugar. And then I put in, because I don't ingest caffeine at all. So I can't, because I have a tremor. But you can use caffeinated black tea, but I use decaffeinated black tea. And I use two usually tea bags in this size mason jar of decaffeinated black tea. And I use 2 tea bags of decaffeinated green tea, because I like green tea. So I put, let's say, 4 tea bags in here, half to 3/4 of a cup of organic cane sugar, and obviously boiling hot water up to about here or so. And then I do not put the SCOBY in there when it's hot. I do not add any of this kombucha to it yet, because it's going to kill the bacteria. So I let it all cool on the counter down to room temperature. Once my tea is at room temperature, my sugared tea is at room temperature, I then take the done kombucha and I pour about this much in to the top of that tea, because I'm going to seed it with the kombucha that has bacteria in it. And then I'm going to take the SCOBY and put it in the top as well. At this one, you'll notice the SCOBY is at the bottom. You see that at the bottom. Now I had to transport this from my home to my office, because that's where I'm presenting from tonight. So sometimes the SCOBY will sink, sometimes it will stay at the top. It doesn't, per se, as far as I know, matter. And then once I've formed my kombucha, I've put the SCOBY in, I've got the sugar tea at room temperature. I then put this little paper cloth on top with the rubber band, and I put this in the cupboard, and it lives there for the next 3 or 4 weeks or more until it ferments. And once it's fermented, or once I decide it's fermented and I decide to make a new batch, I go through the process I just described, and the kombucha that's done, I put it in my refrigerator, and for about a week, I put it in my smoothies, I take a swig of it, and I'm getting my fermented kombucha probiotic fermented drink. And the new batch is in the cupboard, fermenting for the next batch when I'm ready to ingest it. And that's it. That's the show and tell. Kombucha is extremely easy. All you need to do is either ask a friend that's making kombucha to give you a SCOBY, because I might pull 3 new SCOBYs out of that batch when I'm done, because they start to form these layers, and you can pull the layers apart and either throw it away or make multiple batches, whatever you plan to do with it. So that's a little show and tell of kombucha. And now I want to get back to the talk. So I'm going to stop my video again, and I'm going to go back to this talk and move on to the next slide here. All right. So moving on now to the lacto fermentation process, preserves food with bacteria with or without the use of milk. So it could have milk involved, it doesn't have to, and so it depends whether you have milk or not in a lacto fermentation process. Examples of lacto fermentation without milk basically is the fermentation of different vegetables, like you see on the slide here. Things like sauerkraut, kimchi, pickles, olives. But when milk is involved, examples include typically yogurt and kefir. Now, to ferment vegetables, every recipe has this basic equation. You're going to have a vegetable, so that's whatever ingredient you choose, whatever vegetable you choose, plus salt minus oxygen, because remember, it's anaerobic. So again, you're going to have your ingredient, which is either beets or asparagus or carrots or radishes or what pickles or cucumbers, I mean, plus salt or a brine minus oxygen, because remember, it's going to be anaerobic. This creates the ideal environment for enhancing good bacteria, lactic acid bacteria, that will repel the bad microorganisms. So this process can be summarized in 5 easy steps. Number 1, clean and cut up your vegetables. Number 2, mix them with salt water. And salt water, guys, is a brine, B-R-I-N-E. A brine equals a water strongly impregnated with salt. That's the definition of brine. Number 3, let the mixture ferment at room temperature. 4, limit the presence of what? Oxygen, because this is an anaerobic process. And 5, wait. Wait a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks until the fermentation process is complete. So let's go a bit more into these steps in a little more detail. So first, again, you're going to clean your vegetables and you're going to cut them up into your desired size. Now, the size in which you desire them to be is completely up to you. There are no rules. Then you're going to pack the vegetables tightly into a sterilized mason jar. Next, you're going to, in a small saucepan, you're going to bring water, salt into a boil and dissolve that. What the heat does is it helps you dissolve the salt, and then you're going to let it cool. But the other thing is, well, how much salt to water? And usually it's about a 4 or 5% salt content, which in one recipe I read, it was 3 tablespoons of salt to 1 quart of water. Now, the other thing about the salt to realize, folks, is you do not want to use iodized salt. It's not going to work well. You want to use the crystallized, like Himalayan salt or sea salt, that's not iodized. There also are many, many recipes out there on the web, folks, to look up for recipes to make brine. You can add things to your water and your salt to give it some more flavor, such as cinnamon or peppercorns or mustard seeds or fennel seeds or coriander or dill seeds. And these are only a few examples. Now, again, once you've made your salt water, your brine, no matter what recipe you follow, if it's just water and salt, or if you add some other things to it, when it's done and it's dissolved, if you did do it on the, the stove and you heated it up, you need to let it cool. Once it's cooled off, you're going to pour the brine you made over your vegetables in the jar. And you're going to add, what's interesting is they say that you need to add a piece of high tannin-based leaf. And the point about this leaf is it's going to retain the crispiness of the vegetables. And some examples of a leaf you can use that's high tannin are grape leaves or bay leaf, or black tea leaves. They talked about 1/8 of a cup of black tea leaves per 1 liter of water. You can even use a green banana peel. And another leaf they listed was oak leaf. Now, the other thing, remember, is this is supposed to be an anaerobic process. And when you put the vegetables in and then you fill the jar with water, the vegetables are going to start to float and rise to the top. But if they're sticking up over the top of the water, then they're going to be exposed to the air and the oxygen. So what they say is you may need to weigh the vegetables down with something on top of them in the beginning to keep them submerged so they're not in the air. But once the fermentation process gets deep into the flesh of the vegetable, they will sink and typically stay under the surface. Then you can leave a top on the jar at room temperature, but each day, because remember this fermentation process is going to cause the bacteria digest and start breaking down the sugars and give off gas. So each day you're going to want to open the jar to let the bubbles of the gases that form during the fermentation process to go off, and you're going to skim off any mold that forms on the top of the liquid, and that's normal. So you would just skim it off. Now, fermentation can take from 5 days to as much as 3 weeks. Every day you can open it, let the gas off, and you can taste the liquid, you can taste the vegetables, and decide for you, when do you think they're done? When are they at a taste and a flavor that you like? Now, keep the fermented veggies, once they're done, in the refrigerator, where they will stay edible while slowly continuing to ferment. But you typically want to consume anything you fermented, the vegetable perspective, in about 3 months typically. So they keep for quite a while, but you don't want to sit them in your refrigerator forever. Now, when fermented, the vegetables should be opaque. They should be crunchy and tart. Slimy or mushy vegetables, guys, are botched fermentation and are considered spoiled. And sadly, you will have to throw these away if that happens, because somehow too much oxygen got in there, or bad bacteria got in there. Now, how do you eat these fermented vegetables? Well, you can stack these veggies on sandwiches. You can toss them in salads. You can chop them right up and eat them right away, or you can fold them into spreads or dips, or you can just eat them as snacks. The options are, there's a plethora of options. Now, sauerkraut is one of the most common and probably the first thing that people typically try. It was one of the first I tried. Now, there's something called mason jar sauerkraut, and it's one of the easiest forms of lacto fermentation to start out with. The German word sauerkraut, literally translated, means sour, which is cabbage, and sour, which is acid, and kraut, which is cabbage. So sauerkraut, sour is acid and kraut is cabbage. Now, there are just 2 simple ingredients you need to make mason sauerkraut: cabbage and salt. So how do you make sauerkraut at home? Well, first you got to buy some cabbage, and you wash it, and then you remove the outer leaf and you set it aside. And then you're going to cut the cabbage up into quarters. You're going to cut it up into 4, and you're going to remove the core. And then you're going to cut each quarter into thin slices down its length, about 1/8 of an inch thick. You're going to place the cabbage slices in a large bowl and then sprinkle them with salt. And again, don't use iodized salt, use a crystalline salt. And then in this bowl, and the salt, with the cabbage and the salt, you're going to start massaging, squeezing, kneading, squashing this sauerkraut with your hands. And you're going to do this for about 15 minutes. Because the whole point here is that the cabbage slices will start to break down and wilt And with the salt, they'll start to release liquid. And in the end, it's going to be juicy and a lot of liquid's going to come from the cabbage. Now, it can be kind of stingy to your hands, so you may need to use gloves, but if it depends on, what's your preference. Now, once you've done this, you're going to place the cabbage slices into your mason jar and keep packing it down and packing it in and packing it in. And you're going to remove any air bubbles by pushing it down and squashing it in. And then you're going to leave 2 inches open from where the sauerkraut is in the jar, to at least 2 inches from the top of the sauerkraut to the top opening of the jar. And then you're going to pour any of the cabbage liquids from the bowl into the jar. And then you're going to take one of the outer leaf pieces that you had set aside, and you're going to roll it up and put it on top and squish that down. And that's going to help keep all the broken down sour cabbage underneath the liquid. If you need to add any water to keep it all submerged, it's fine to do that. You also can either purchase these glass, things that you're going to push down into the mason jar, or you can use another mason jar to push the cabbage down and weigh it down, because again, it's just like any vegetable fermentation, it needs to be submerged in the liquid. But then once it's submerged in the liquid and you have a leaf or the cabbage, the extra cabbage leaf on top, you cover it with a cheesecloth and you seal around the opening with a rubber band. And this will ensure that the cabbage can breathe, but again, it should be submerged under the water. And then all you do is sit it on your cupboard or put it up in the cupboard, and you store at room temperature in the dark. As the cabbage ferments, check to see that the cabbage stays under the liquid, and push down the jar inside if you need to keep it submerged. And again, bubbles may form at the top and may even rise and spill out of the jar. This is all completely normal. After about the first week, you can start tasting your sauerkraut each day and determine whether you feel it's done enough for you or not. When it's tangy enough to your liking, store it in the refrigerator, and again, it can keep up to as much as 3 months or so. Now, miso, this is made from fermented soybeans and is packed with yummy, salty flavor that can be used for much more than miso soup. Miso is the ultimate reference point for the flavor sensation known as umami. The thick paste is deeply savory, with toasty, funky, salty, sweet richness. This umami flavor forms the base of a lot of everyday Japanese cooking. You can grab a tub in the grocery store next time you're there, and then Google or look on the internet for some recipes to be using miso. If you're not using it, it is a yummy addition and a flavor to foods. Now, Beet Kavas is a fermented beverage. So you're not doing this to eat, if you will, kvass, the beets. You're doing it to create the tonic, the liquid from the beets. So Beet Kavas is a fermented beverage with many uses, including cocktails, vinaigrettes, and you can even just drink it on its own. It's got a very earthy flavor and a bit of fizziness. If you've ever tried Beet Kavas, it's earthy, it's salty, it's sour, and it's sweet. It's a jewel-toned lacto-fermented beverage, and it's full of probiotic goodness. Plus, it's ridiculously easy and affordable to brew right on your kitchen counter. So making Beet Kavas is, again, similar to the making of sauerkraut or traditional dill pickles or kimchi, so any of the lacto-fermented vegetables. Traditional to Russia and the Ukraine, Beet Kavas is the result of fermentation by friendly lactobacillus bacteria. And again, it gives it a tangy flavor. Now, some recipes for beet kvass will call for you to add whey. Now, whey speeds up the fermentation process. But remember that whey is the base of dairy. So if you're sensitive to dairy, then you should not add whey to it, and you don't have to. Because kvass can be made very simply from beets, water, and salt, just like any of the fermented vegetables can. So depending on the ingredients, your environment, and your personal taste, this fermentation process may take a couple of days to a couple of weeks. Now, when it's done, you may drink it straight up as a daily tonic or cook with it like vinegar, or it's great in salads, or it's great in soups. So again, what do? You get the beets, you scrub them up, you trim them up, you cut them up, but many times you will leave the skins on. You'll dice them up and cut them up into about 1/2 inch cubes. The shape or size doesn't really matter, but it's approximately 1/2 inch size cubes. And you're going to put them into, again, a jar. And you're going to place the beets in a clean, sterilized jar, and you're going to add the salt. Now, if you wish to add other flavors like ginger, lemon, orange, or spices, you can. And then you're going to, again, you get in the theme of this, you're going to add water, and you're going to cover the beets. You're going to leave at least 1 inch of headspace at the top of the jar, and you may even put something in the top. They make these, again, glass discs to try and push down in the top of the jar the beets so that they stay submerged. And then you can cover the jar tightly. And the jar stands at room temperature. Again, each day you may see bubbles, and you're going to open the lid just to let the bubbles off. And you can skim off any mold that forms. And then you can taste it after a few days, taste it and see if it's at the flavoring you would like. When it tastes strong enough for your liking, with this, you're going to strain out the beets and transfer the kvass to the refrigerator. Remember, you're keeping the liquid, not necessarily the beets, to make beet kvass. You can drink it right away, but it's often best after a few days. As a fermented beverage, this kvass will last for quite some time, at least a month or longer. Now, what about the beets? I was like, wait a minute, do you just throw the beets away? Well, first of all, they are now a fermented vegetable, so you can just put them in salads and you can eat the fermented vegetables also. Or they talked about the fact that you can use the same beets to make another batch of beet kvass. So you can put the beets into another jar, or the same jar they're in, pour the liquid off into a different jar, add new salt, and start your process all over again. All right, we're getting to the last example here that I wanted to talk about tonight, and that is fermented black garlic. And you see the garlic on this slide, it's like, wow, it really is black. So what is black garlic? Black garlic is a hard-neck variety garlic that has been fermented through a slow cooking process at a steady temperature. And the color of the garlic turns black from the cooking process. It not only the color changes, but the density and the texture of the garlic changes, and it feels almost like a gummy bear when it's turned into black garlic. And black garlic is a very strong antioxidant. It is considered a health food that has been eaten in Eastern Asian countries for centuries. And at my clinic a few years back, we actually did a study on black garlic, fermented black garlic, and its effect on cholesterol. We had a number of volunteers sign up for a study, and everybody ingested at least one piece of black garlic a day for X amount of time, and we tested their cholesterol at the beginning and we tested at the end. And I did a YouTube presentation on the results of our study. If you're interested, you can go to our Discover Health Functional Medicine Center YouTube page and just search black garlic, and I'm sure you'll come up with that talk and the results of our study, because it did show some benefits for lowering cholesterol. And White Gates Farm in Tamworth, New Hampshire, local to us here in the Mount Washington Valley, is is a local source still for black garlic, and they're the ones that provided us with the black garlic for our study. Now, some benefits of black garlic that have been cited by the National Center for Biotechnology Information lists black garlic as, first of all, loaded with antioxidants. It helps to fight cancer growth. It boosts heart health and affects cholesterol, which is what our study was on. It preserves cognitive function, stabilizes blood sugar, and boosts the immune system. So black garlic is amazing. The one thing I would say is that in my reading, it is said don't really source it from China. You do want to know what your source is, just because of the toxins in the soil. So as some last comments, as we mentioned earlier, if you have a gut issue, try and limit your intake of fermented foods until you restore a healthy balance of good bacteria in your gut. Start with small amounts and cut back if you feel any discomfort. You can even start by simply sipping each day the liquid of a fermented vegetable or other products like kombucha, and just increase as you tolerate it. Just remember, when it comes to populating or seeding your microbiome with an optimal diversity of microorganisms, nothing will do this better than homemade probiotic and fermented foods. The homemade ones you make will have so many types of bacteria and organisms in it that you could never get from anything commercially made. Now, as we always have done with these webinars, we will post in our Discover Health Facebook group tomorrow the resources that were used to create this talk, so people can look further into this topic as you so choose. There'll be these website addresses and links to a lot of information. If you are not a member of our Discover Health Facebook group and you do go to Facebook, then all you need to do is go to Facebook and look up our Discover Health Functional Medicine Center Facebook page and request. You'll see there on that page that there's a place to request to become a member of our Discover Health Facebook group. And then you just join. It is a closed group, but of course, anyone requesting to join pretty much obviously becomes a member. It's just you do have to request it. If you don't go to Facebook at all and you would like the information, then I'll give ways for you to reach out to us in just other ways in just a moment. So we've covered a lot of ground, and in just a moment, I'm gonna, again, if you may have been putting questions in the chat, which I'll look at in just a moment. So if you're thinking of one right now and you want to type it in there, go ahead. Or just wait a moment, and as soon as I finish here and one or more slides, I'm gonna stop sharing the slides and I'm going to come back on with my video, and if someone wants to unmute and ask a question, you can. So thank you all so much for spending your time with me. I hope that you've all learned some valuable information about fermented foods. And again, if you have questions, comments, or if you'd like to get this information but you don't go on Facebook, then don't hesitate to contact us at Discover Health Functional Medicine Center. You can either call us. Our phone number is 603-447-3112, or you can reach out to us via email. The email address that we use most for folks is discoverhealthcoaching@gmail.com. And if you go to our website, there is a ton of educational information, as well as a way to communicate with us via our website as well. And the website address is Discover Health, F as in functional, M as in medicine, C as in center. So discoverhealthfmc.com.